My name is Audrey Vance, and for the better part of a decade, I have existed as the invisible structural integrity of Omnicorp, holding the title of Lead Systems Architect, a designation that sounds impressive on a business card, but in practice meant that I was the custodian of the company's soul, while others sold its skin. I am 42 years old. I drive a Volvo because safety is a variable I can control, and I operate under a singular professional doctrine. Systems do not fail because of bad luck. They fail because of bad architecture. I had spent 10 years building the Genesis platform, a proprietary machine learning framework designed to predict micro-market fluctuations with a speed that bordered on clairvoyance. It was a masterpiece of back-end engineering, a labyrinth of logic and predictive algorithms that I had coded by hand, line by agonizing line, in a windowless basement long before we had glass offices and ergonomic chairs. Genesis was scheduled to debut on the New York Stock Exchange in exactly 24 hours, an event that was projected to turn the paper wealth of our executive team into tangible, yacht-buying reality. But as I sat in my corner office at 8:45 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt more like a funeral than a workday, I wasn't thinking about wealth or stock tickers or the champagne that was currently chilling in the executive break room. I was thinking about the digital forensic audit I had conducted on the company server at 2 o'clock in the morning. I hadn't run the audit on a whim. My brain is wired to detect anomalies, to hear the discordant note in a symphony of data. For weeks, there had been a subtle latency in the system's compliance logs, a millisecond flicker in the metadata that no one else would notice, but to me, it sounded like a scream. Driven by a nagging intuition that felt like a splinter in my mind, I had bypassed the standard user interface and dove into the raw administrative logs. The audit confirmed the horrifying truth, a reality so cold it made the air in my home office freeze. My name had been systematically purged from the prospectus, the founding documents, and the patent attributions. It wasn't just a deletion, it was a replacement. My legacy had been overwritten by the name of a 24-year-old junior product manager named Kyle, a boy who thought back-end coding was something you hired a freelancer to do on the weekend and whose primary contribution to the company so far had been organizing the Fantasy Football League. It wasn't an error. It was a surgical excision performed by Sterling, our chief executive officer, a man I had known since we were sharing instant noodles in a garage, a man who had decided that my 15% equity stake was too expensive to maintain now that the heavy lifting was done. He looked at me and saw a legacy cost. I looked at him and saw a man sawing off the branch he was standing on. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office, a relentless gray sheet that matched the sterile, monochromatic aesthetic of the 42nd floor. The office was designed to be a panopticon of productivity. Everything was glass, chrome, and polished concrete, an environment where privacy was non-existent, and every movement was observed. I could hear the hum of the open-plan floor behind me, the nervous energy of 200 employees who were terrified of losing their jobs before the big payout. They typed furiously, their eyes glued to their screens, but the tension was palpable, a static charge in the air. They knew something was wrong. In a corporate ecosystem, the scent of blood travels faster than a fiber optic signal, and the entire floor was holding its breath, waiting for the axe to fall. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the cool surface of my mahogany desk, watching the reflection of the room in my monitor. I didn't open my email. I didn't check the Slack channels where the rumors were undoubtedly flying. I simply waited for the performance to begin. I knew the protocol better than they did because I had helped write the employee handbook years ago, back when we thought we were building a family instead of a factory farm. At 9:15 a.m., the soft chime of the elevator announced the arrival of the termination squad. The sound was distinct, a cheerful ding that signaled the end of my career. Corinne, the director of human resources, walked toward my office. She clutched a flat, beige cardboard box against her chest like a shield, her knuckles white against the cheap material. Corinne was a decent woman, a mother who remembered birthdays and organized charity drives, but today she had been reduced to an instrument of executive malice, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by the man upstairs. Trailing a few paces behind her was Benny, the senior security guard, a heavy-set man whose face I had seen every morning for a decade. We had discussed his daughter's college applications, his bad knee, the weather. Today, Benny stared fixedly at the carpet, unable to meet the eyes of the executive he was about to escort out like a criminal. He radiated a profound sense of shame, his shoulders hunched, his uniform suddenly looking too tight. He had his orders. They were coming to execute a termination. I watched them approach with the emotional detachment of a scientist observing a critical reaction. Sterling was undoubtedly watching from his glass aquarium on the upper mezzanine, his gaze fixed on the security feed, anticipating the spectacle. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to lash out, to throw a stapler, to grab my hard drive, to give him any justifiable footage that would allow him to strip my unvested stock options for gross misconduct. He wanted a villain so he could be the hero who saved the company. When Corinne finally reached my door, she hesitated. The glass walls offered no soundproofing against the visual weight of the moment. She looked pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting nervously toward the ceiling cameras. She knocked on the glass frame, even though the door was wide open. I swiveled my chair slowly to face her, the leather creaking in the silence. "Come in, Corinne," I said, my voice steady, modulated, devoid of the tremor she was undoubtedly expecting. She stepped inside, Benny lingering in the doorway like a reluctant jailer, blocking the exit. "Audrey," she began, her voice cracking slightly before she cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the corporate mask back into place. "Audrey, as part of the pre-IPO strategic restructuring, the board has decided to eliminate the position of lead systems architect, effective immediately. We are placing you on administrative leave pending a review of access logs and proprietary data handling." It was a script, a carefully, legally vetted sequence of words designed to dehumanize the recipient and protect the corporation from liability. She held out the box, her hands shaking slightly. "You may take personal items only. No electronics, no data storage devices, no documents." I looked at the box. It was flimsy, cheap, a perfect metaphor for how they viewed my decade of labor. I didn't let her finish the instructions. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my blazer with a slow, deliberate motion that made Benny shift his weight nervously. "That won't be necessary, Corinne," I said, my voice maintaining its measured calm, cutting through her anxiety like a scalpel. I looked around the room. There was a framed photo of my parents on the bookshelf. There was a potted succulent I had kept alive for 5 years. There was a crystal award for Innovator of the Year gathering dust in the corner. I left them all. Taking them would imply that I was accepting this narrative, that I was scavenging through the wreckage of my own life to salvage scraps. Leaving them behind was a statement of profound indifference. It signaled that nothing in this room, nothing in this building, was worth the effort of packing. I picked up my purse from the floor and my car keys from the desk. That was it. I saw Benny flinch as I walked past him. He prepared to grab my arm, a reflex trained into him for hostile terminations, but he stopped when he saw my face. There was no hostility, only a terrifying calm. "I know the way out, Benny," I said quietly, giving him an almost imperceptible nod of understanding. As the elevator doors slid shut, framing Corinne's bewildered expression and Sterling's smug silhouette in the distance, I took a single, deep breath. They thought they had cut off a limb. I knew I had just released the virus. The drive home was a blur of torrential rain and brake lights. The interior of my car was a sanctuary of silence, a stark contrast to the cacophony of betrayal playing out in my head. I didn't listen to the radio. I didn't want to hear the breathless financial news reporting on the record-breaking anticipation for the Omnicorp launch. They were selling a ghost. I pulled into my driveway, the house standing quiet and stoic in the storm. This house was paid for by the bonuses of the early years, back when Sterling needed me to fix the critical bugs that threatened to bankrupt us, back when he called me the miracle worker. I walked inside, locked the door, and went straight to my study. This was my real office. The walls were lined with technical manuals, legal texts, and the history of computing. I walked to the painting of the coastline on the far wall, a generic piece of art chosen specifically for its dimensions, and swung it aside to reveal the wall safe. My hands were steady, practiced, as I dialed the combination. Right 3 turns, left 2, right 1. The tumblers clicked into place with the mechanical weight of absolute certainty. Inside lay a single leather-bound portfolio. It smelled of old paper and importance. I carried it to my desk and opened it. These were the original incorporation documents, the founder's agreement, signed 8 years ago on a folding table in a rented storage unit. I flipped past the equity splits, past the vesting schedules, until I reached page 42. There it was, Clause 17B. We called it the dead man's switch when we wrote it, a joke back then, but a rigorous legal safeguard inserted at my insistence because I knew, even then, that Sterling was a salesman, not a builder. The text was dense, written in the archaic language of contract law, but the meaning was razor-sharp. In the event that the proprietary Genesis source code is not commercially deployed under the direct, continuous, and active supervision of the primary inventor by the 5th anniversary of the patent filing, all rights, title, interest, and source code ownership shall automatically revert to the primary inventor without requirement of further notice. I pulled out my phone and opened the calendar app, though I already knew the answer. The patent filing date was exactly 5 years and 2 days ago. The deadline had passed on Sunday. Sterling had been so consumed with the roadshow, so focused on courting investors in London and Singapore, so busy inflating the valuation, that he had neglected the foundational housekeeping of his own empire. He assumed the license was perpetual. He assumed I would always be there to validate the chain of custody. By firing me this morning, by officially removing me from direct supervision, he hadn't just terminated an employee, he had inadvertently severed the company's legal claim to its own product. The code that ran the company, the code that was currently processing millions of transactions and dazzling investors, no longer belonged to Omnicorp. It belonged to Audrey Vance. My contemplation was shattered by the harsh ring of my encrypted video conference line. I stared at the screen. It was the scheduled final technical due diligence call with the underwriting bank. In the chaos of firing me, Sterling had forgotten to cancel it. Or, more likely, he arrogantly assumed he could handle it himself, then realized at the last second that he didn't know the answers. Or perhaps he hadn't told the bank he fired me yet, fearful that losing the lead architect 24 hours before IPO would spook the investors. I let it ring 3 times, weighing my options. If I ignored it, they might reschedule. If I answered, I had a chance to set the trap. I smoothed my hair, adjusted the lighting to look professional, and clicked accept. The screen filled with the faces of the audit team, 3 men in a boardroom in Manhattan, looking exhausted and serious. And there, in the top right window, was Sterling. He was in his office, the same office I had just walked away from. He looked flushed, his tie slightly askew. When he saw me connect, his eyes widened in a split second of panic before he masked it with a forced, predatory smile. He was gambling that I wouldn't blow up the deal because I still wanted my stock options to be worth something. He didn't know I had already mentally burned those options to ash. "Audrey," Sterling said, his voice too loud, too jovial. "So glad you could hop on. I know you're taking some personal time today, but the team just had one final box to check." The audacity was breathtaking. He was framing my termination as a personal day. The lead auditor, a man named Mr. Henderson with wire-rimmed glasses, looked at his clipboard. "Miss Vance, thank you for joining. This is the final verification for the Risk Assessment Committee. Can you formally certify, for the record, that the Genesis platform is stable, secure, and operating in full compliance with all internal governance protocols and licensing agreements?" The room went silent. Sterling stopped breathing. He stared at me through the camera, a silent threat in his eyes. "Play along," his look said. "Don't ruin this." I looked directly into the camera lens, projecting the image of the ultimate professional. I didn't blink. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice clear and authoritative, "I can confirm that the Genesis system is stable. It is secure. And it is currently operating exactly as the founding protocols and legal agreements dictate." It was the truth. The founding agreements dictated that the software now belonged to me. The system was running on my authority, by my grace, until I decided otherwise. I was not lying to the bank. I was simply letting them rely on an assumption that was no longer valid. Sterling exhaled, his shoulders dropping in relief. "Excellent," he said, cutting in before the auditor could ask a follow-up. "There you have it. Compliance is green. Thanks, Audrey. Go get some rest." He disconnected the call abruptly. The screen went black. I sat in the silence of my study, feeling the adrenaline vibrate in my fingertips. Sterling thought he had just dodged a bullet. He didn't realize he had just let me load the gun. Now, I had to move fast. The timeline was compressing. I opened my laptop, avoiding the company network entirely, and logged into the Delaware Division of Corporations portal. I had prepared the draft for this entity months ago, a contingency plan I hoped I would never have to use. The company name was EchoLogic LLC, a meaningless, faceless name. I paid the expedited filing fee with my personal credit card. 7 minutes later, I received the digital confirmation. EchoLogic was born. Next came the transfer. Acting as the individual Audrey Vance, the legal owner of the reverted IP, I executed a binding assignment of intellectual property document. I transferred every line of code, every algorithm, every patent right of the Genesis system into the possession of EchoLogic LLC. I was no longer just a disgruntled ex-employee. I was a holding company, but the most critical step was the notification. Under the law, I had to inform the infringing party that their license had expired. If I didn't, they could claim ignorance in court. I drafted a formal notice of license, termination, and cease and desist. The language was brutal. It demanded the immediate shutdown of all Genesis-related servers. I printed it on heavy, cream-colored bond paper. I signed it with a fountain pen. Then, I placed it in a red, urgent envelope. This was the pivot point. If I sent this to Sterling directly, he would call his army of lawyers and file an emergency injunction to block me before the IPO. He would tie me up in litigation and claim the company owned the IP under work-for-hire doctrines, burying the reversion clause under mountains of paperwork. I needed them to receive the notice legally, but not act on it operationally. I needed to leverage their own incompetence against them. I addressed the envelope to Omnicorp Legal Department, ATTN, General Counsel, 12th floor. I knew, because I monitored the expense reports, that Sterling had fired the general counsel and the entire in-house legal team 3 weeks ago to make the quarterly burn rate look better for the investors. He had replaced them with an outsourced firm that worked remotely from Chicago. The 12th floor of the Omnicorp building was currently a ghost town. There was no general counsel. There were no paralegals. There was only a reception desk manned by a rotating temp agency worker whose only job was to sign for packages and toss them into a bin to be scanned whenever. I put on my raincoat and drove to the main post office. I paid for certified mail with return receipt requested. This was the highest standard of proof. The postal clerk, a bored woman chewing gum, stamped the receipt and handed it to me. I held that slip of paper like it was a winning lottery ticket. Tomorrow morning, a temp would sign for that letter. The tracking system would log it as delivered to corporate HQ. Legally, Omnicorp would be notified. Practically, the letter would sit in a plastic bin on an empty floor while Sterling popped champagne upstairs. I had satisfied the law while blinding the enemy. But paperwork alone wouldn't stop a billion-dollar launch. I needed an enforcer. I needed someone with the resources to fight a war and the motivation to burn Sterling to the ground. There was only one option. I drove 45 minutes south, away from the gleaming tech district and into the gritty industrial park near the cargo airport. The rain was unrelenting, turning the asphalt into black mirrors. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner called The Hangar. It was a place of grease and chrome, smelling of burnt coffee and aviation fuel, the kind of place where deals are made in the shadows, far from the polished boardrooms of the city. Sitting in the back booth, obscured by the shadows and the steam rising from a mug, was Elias Thorne. Elias was the CEO of Apex Industries, Omnicorp's only real rival. 5 years ago, Apex was the market leader. Today, they were trading at penny stock levels, crushed by the efficiency of the Genesis platform I had built. Elias looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. His tie was undone, his collar frayed, his eyes red-rimmed and staring into a cup of black coffee, as if reading his fortune in the dregs. He looked up when I approached, his expression shifting from weariness to suspicion. He recognized me instantly. To him, I was the architect of his destruction. The woman who wrote the code that made his company obsolete. "If you're here to gloat, Audrey," he said, his voice gravelly, scraping against the silence, "save it. I'm not in the mood." I slid into the booth opposite him. The vinyl seat squeaked. "I'm not here to gloat, Elias, and I'm not here to ask for a job." He scoffed, a bitter sound. "Then what? You want to buy my office furniture for the Omnicorp expansion?" "I want to give you the weapon that kills Omnicorp," I said quietly. Elias froze. He looked at me. Really looked at me, searching for the trick. "Sterling fired you," he guessed. "I saw the rumors on the dark web forums this morning. You're disgruntled." "I'm not disgruntled," I corrected him. "I'm divested. And as of 48 hours ago, I am also the sole legal owner of the software Omnicorp is about to launch." I placed the folder on the table between us. I opened it to the reversion clause and the fresh Delaware filing for Echo Logic. Elias read them. He read them slowly, his eyes scanning the lines of text, his brain processing the implications. I watched his face change. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, hungry intensity. He looked at the dates, he did the math. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly open. "He missed the renewal?" Elias whispered. "Sterling missed the renewal?" "He was too busy selling the future to secure the present," I said. Elias laughed, a dry, incredulous sound. "So, you own it. You own Genesis. What do you want? Cash? Equity? If this holds up, I can get the board to approve 10 million by noon." "I don't want money," I said. "Sterling has more money than you. If I sue him, he'll drag it out for 10 years. He'll bury me. I need a shield. I need an army of lawyers who are ready to file an injunction the second the market opens." I slid the final document toward him. It was a licensing agreement. "This grants Apex Industries exclusive, worldwide, irrevocable rights to the Genesis platform. It locks Omnicorp out. It makes their product illegal the moment you sign." Elias looked at the feline. $1? "Consideration," I said, "to make it a binding contract. But read the addendum. Apex agrees to cover all legal costs associated with enforcing the IP rights against infringers." Elias looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. He realized what I was doing. I wasn't just giving him a product, I was giving him a loaded gun and pointing it at his enemy's head. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy Mont Blanc pen. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a man who had been drowning and was suddenly handed a boat. He signed the document. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the only sound in the diner. He pushed the folder back to me. "It's done," he said. "I'll have my general counsel wake up the judge. We'll have the temporary restraining order filed by 8 a.m. Make sure the process server is at the Omnicorp auditorium," I said. "I want Sterling served while he's on stage." Elias smiled, and for the first time, it was a genuine, dangerous smile. "Audrey, I'll serve him myself." I stood up. The deal was struck. The trap was armed. Omnicorp was hours away from the biggest day in its history, and they were flying a plane with no engines. I walked out of the diner and back into the rain. For the first time all day, the air felt clean. Phase 1 was complete. Now, I just had to watch them fall. The morning of the initial public offering arrived with a deceptive, porcelain fragility, the storm from the previous night having washed the city clean, leaving behind a sky of piercing, innocent blue that felt almost mocking in its clarity. I sat in the center of my living room, the curtains drawn against the morning sun to prevent any glare on the 60-inch monitor I had mounted specifically for this moment. Wrapped in a heavy cashmere throw that felt like armor, I held a cup of tea in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my palms, a stark, grounding contrast to the icy, calculated certainty settling in my chest. On the screen, the Omnicorp launch event was streaming live, a spectacle of modern corporate theater held in a massive auditorium that had been rented for the price of a small house. The production value was aggressive. The stage was bathed in blinding shades of electric blue and metallic silver, the company colors designed to evoke a sleek, frictionless future that Sterling had sold to the world but had not yet actually built. The camera panned over the audience in high definition, capturing the faces of institutional investors, tech journalists in expensive blazers, and the rows of exhausted employees who had been promised that today would be the day their paper stock options turned into Ferraris. They looked hungry. They looked like believers gathered for a revival, waiting for the miracle to occur. I scanned the crowd on the screen with the precision of a sniper looking for targets. I saw Corinne from Human Resources in the third row, wearing a new designer dress that she had likely bought on credit in anticipation of the payout, clapping enthusiastically as the lights dimmed. I saw Benny, the head of security, standing by the emergency exit, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform, his eyes scanning the room for threats, completely unaware that the real threat was sitting 5 miles away in pajamas, holding a teacup. They were all there, the unwitting supporting cast of a tragedy that was about to masquerade as a triumph. Then, the music swelled. A rhythmic, bass-heavy electronic track meant to simulate the heartbeat of innovation. And Sterling walked onto the stage. He looked magnificent. I had to give him that. He was wearing a bespoke Italian suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the charisma of a man who believes he has cheated gravity. He raised his hands, quieting the applause with a benevolent smile, and began his speech. It was a good speech. It should have been. I had written the core philosophy of it in internal memos years ago. He spoke of structural integrity and foundational logic, repurposing my engineering doctrines into hollow marketing slogans. "We didn't just build a system," Sterling bellowed, his voice echoing with practiced gravitas. "We built a new language for the market, a language that belongs exclusively to Omnicorp, a language that is proprietary, protected, and poised to dominate." He paused for effect, allowing the word proprietary to hang in the air like a ripe fruit. It was the specific legal trigger I had been waiting for. By claiming ownership on a public stage, in front of the SEC regulators and the global market, he wasn't just lying, he was committing securities fraud in real time, broadcast in 4K resolution to the entire world. I took a slow sip of tea. The Earl Grey bitter on my tongue. "Not anymore, Sterling," I whispered to the empty room. "You're selling a house you don't own." Sterling turned toward the massive LED screen behind him, which was currently displaying a mesmerizing, rotating graphic of the Genesis Code architecture, my architecture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, reaching the crescendo of his performance, sweat glistening on his forehead under the hot stage lights. "I invite you to witness the future. Let's bring Genesis online." He pressed a large, ceremonial button on the podium. This was the moment. This was the signal for the servers in the secure data center to handshake with the trading floor, initiating the live data stream. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The rotating graphic continued to spin, the audience held its breath. Sterling kept his smile fixed, though I saw a tiny, involuntary twitch at the corner of his eye, a micro-expression of panic that only someone who knew him as well as I did would catch. Then, the screen flickered. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It wasn't a blackout. It was something far more terrifying for a technology company that prided itself on stability. The beautiful, high-resolution graphics vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, flat blue background. The color of a system failure. The color of death for a software platform. In the center of the massive screen, white text appeared, typed out in the harsh, unforgiving font of a command line interface. It was legible from the back of the room. It was legible on the live stream. System halted. Critical error. License key expired. Unauthorized user detected. All processes terminated by system administrator. A murmur rippled through the crowd, sounding like the rustling of dry leaves in a sudden wind. Sterling laughed nervously, tapping his microphone, the sound thumping through the speakers. "A little technical glitch, folks," he said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the fear rising in his throat. "The live feed is just buffering. We'll have that sorted in a second." He gestured frantically to the wings of the stage, where the technical director was undoubtedly screaming into a headset, trying to override a lockout that was hard-coded into the kernel. But the screen didn't change. The text remained, burning into the retinas of every investor in the room. Then, a second line of text appeared below the first, blinking with a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched my own heartbeat. "Property of EchoLogic, LLC. Please contact the legal owner to restore access." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. It was a vacuum. The name EchoLogic meant nothing to the audience yet, but the phrase legal owner meant everything. Sterling froze. He stared at the screen, his face draining of color, transforming in real time from a master of the universe into a man realizing he was standing naked in a blizzard. He turned back to the audience, opening his mouth to spin another lie, perhaps to blame a hacker or a cyber attack. But before he could speak, movement at the side of the stage caught the camera's attention. It wasn't a technician. It wasn't security. It was Elias Thorne. The CEO of Apex Industries walked onto the stage with the slow, heavy gait of an executioner. He was wearing a raincoat over his suit, dripping water onto the polished floor, looking like a specter from the storm outside. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked only at Sterling. Sterling stepped back, his microphone picking up a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. "Elias?" he stammered, the audio booming through the speakers, stripping him of his last shred of dignity. "What the hell are you doing here? Get off my stage!" Elias didn't stop. He walked straight to the podium, reached into his damp coat, and pulled out a thick envelope. It wasn't a prop. It was a heavy, bound document, stamped with the seal of the Federal District Court. Elias leaned into the microphone, his voice gravelly and exhausted, amplified to thousands of people watching in the room and millions watching online. "I'm not here to crash your party, Sterling," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I'm here to serve you." He slammed the envelope onto the podium. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. "This is a temporary restraining order and a cease and desist," Elias announced. "Issued this morning by the District Court. You are operating on stolen intellectual property. The Genesis platform is licensed exclusively to Apex Industries." Elias looked up at the screen, at the blinking words, "property of Echo Logic," then back at Sterling, locking eyes with the man who had tried to bankrupt him. "Your license expired on Sunday, Sterling. You're trespassing." The room erupted. It wasn't applause, it was chaos. Phones lit up instantly as investors scrambled to call their brokers. Journalists were typing furiously, breaking the story that would end Omnicorp's existence. The live stream chat moved so fast it became a blur of confusion, panic, and memes. Sterling grabbed the envelope, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He ripped it open, scanning the first page. I knew exactly what he was seeing. He was seeing the reversion clause. He was seeing the chain of title. He was seeing his own signature from 8 years ago, the signature that had just signed his death warrant. He looked up, searching the blinding lights, searching the audience, searching for someone to blame. And for a brief second, he looked directly into the camera lens. He looked at me. I took another sip of tea. The tea was still warm. The company, however, was already cold. The stock ticker for Omnicorp, which was supposed to start trading in 10 minutes, never opened. The New York Stock Exchange suspended the listing indefinitely due to material legal discrepancies. In the span of 12 minutes, the valuation of the company went from $2 billion to zero. I turned off the TV. The silence in my house was beautiful. The aftermath was not swift. It was a slow, grinding disintegration that played out over the next 96 hours. For 3 days, I did not leave my house. I didn't need to. The world outside was burning, but my perimeter was secure. I watched the fallout from a distance, observing the collapse of the empire I had built but no longer owned. The news cycle was relentless. Financial pundits dissected the EchoLogic incident with breathless excitement. They called it the greatest due diligence failure in corporate history. They analyzed the reversion clause, marveling at its simplicity and lethality. Legal experts went on television to explain that while Sterling had physical possession of the servers, he did not have the legal right to turn them on. It was the digital equivalent of stealing a car but not having the keys. Every time they mentioned the unknown architect behind the clause, I felt a quiet, private satisfaction. I didn't need fame. I needed accuracy. My phone rang incessantly. Corinne called 7 times, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to accusing. Benny called once, probably just to see if I was okay. I didn't answer. I had nothing to say to them. They were passengers on a ship that the captain had steered into an iceberg. My sympathy for them did not extend to helping them bail water when I had built the iceberg myself. On the 4th evening, the rain returned, tapping against the window panes like a nervous guest. The doorbell rang. It wasn't the aggressive pounding of a process server or the polite chime of a delivery driver. It was a hesitant, desperate pressing of the button. I checked the security camera feed on my tablet. It was Sterling. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in 4 days. He was wearing the same suit he had worn on stage, now rumpled and stained, his tie missing, his shirt collar unbuttoned. He stood on my porch, staring at the door, rain dripping from his hair. A fallen king, waiting for an audience with the peasant he had exiled. I walked to the door and opened it, leaving the security chain latched. The metal chain allowed the door to open only 4 inches, enough to speak, but not enough to enter. It was a physical barrier that mirrored the legal one I had erected between us. "Audrey?" he said. His voice was a husk, cracked from days of shouting at lawyers. He smelled of scotch and desperation. I looked at him through the gap. "Sterling," I acknowledged, my voice neutral. "Let me in," he pleaded, his hands gripping the doorframe. "We need to talk. We can fix this. I can make it right." "There is no we, Sterling," I said calmly. "And there is nothing to fix. The system is working exactly as designed." He leaned his forehead against the wood, closing his eyes. "I'll give you everything," he whispered, the fight draining out of him. "I'll give you the equity back. I'll give you 20%. 30. Just call Elias. Tell him it was a mistake. Tell him you transferred the rights back to Omnicorp. Please." I watched him unravel. He still didn't get it. He thought this was a negotiation. He thought this was about leverage for a better salary or a bigger bonus. He couldn't conceive of a world where money wasn't the only currency, where dignity and ownership had a value that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. "I didn't do this for money," I said. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with genuine confusion. "Then why?" he asked. "Why burn it all down? You built it, Audrey. It was your baby. Why kill it?" "I didn't kill it," I corrected him, my voice hardening. "I saved it. You were going to prostitute it. You were going to strip it for parts and sell it to the highest bidder without understanding how it worked. You erased my name, Sterling. You thought you could rewrite history because you held the pen." I stepped back, preparing to close the door. "I just reminded you that I own the paper." "Audrey, please," he begged, his voice rising in panic as the realization of his total defeat washed over him. "I'm facing jail time. The SEC is investigating. The investors are suing for fraud. If you don't help me, I'm finished." "You were finished the moment you signed that termination letter," I said. "You just didn't know it yet." I closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. I listened to his footsteps retreat down the wet pavement, slow and heavy, walking away into the obscurity he had tried to force upon me. 6 months later, the rain had finally stopped, and the city was bathed in the crisp light of early autumn. I parked my Volvo in the visitor's lot of the building that used to be the headquarters of Omnicorp. The signage had changed. The silver and blue logo was gone, replaced by the stark, industrial black and red of Apex Industries. The acquisition had been pennies on the dollar, a fire sale in bankruptcy court. Apex had purchased the physical assets of Omnicorp. The servers, the office furniture, the coffee machines, the lease on the building. But the crown jewel, the Genesis platform, was not part of the sale. That was already licensed to Apex, securely and legally, through EchoLogic LLC. I walked into the lobby. The security desk was still there, but Benny was gone, replaced by a younger guard who didn't know my face and asked for my ID with polite indifference. I clipped on my visitor badge. It felt strange to be a guest in a building where I knew the wiring diagram of the elevators better than the architects did. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The atmosphere had changed completely. The frantic, nervous energy of the Sterling era was gone, replaced by the focused, quiet intensity of engineers who were actually working. The glass walls were still there, but the fear was gone. Elias was waiting for me in the corner office, the office that used to be Sterling's. He had replaced the ostentatious aquarium with a functional whiteboard covered in equations and architectural diagrams. He looked healthier, the dark circles under his eyes gone, his suit tailored and pressed. Apex was thriving. The Genesis platform, properly managed and ethically deployed, had stabilized the market and made Apex the dominant player in the sector. "Audrey," he said, standing up and offering his hand. You're early. I like to be precise, I said, shaking his hand. He gestured to the view of the city skyline. It's a hell of a view, he said. I can see why Sterling liked it, though I prefer looking at the code. He turned to me, his expression serious. The team is waiting in the conference room. We're ready to deploy the version 2 update, but I told them we don't push the button until the architect signs off. He wasn't asking for permission. He was offering respect. He was acknowledging the chain of command that relied on competence, not title. I have one condition, I said. Elias nodded immediately. Name it. The attribution, I said. In the metadata. In the user manual. In the boot sequence. It's already there, Elias said with a grin. We hard-coded its system architecture by Audrey Vance. It can't be deleted without crashing the kernel. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had felt in half a year. We walked out of the office and down the hall toward the server room. I passed my old office. It was occupied by a team of 3 junior developers, arguing passionately about an API integration. They looked happy. They looked like builders. I walked into the server room. The hum of the cooling fans washed over me, a familiar, comforting white noise that sounded like home. The lights on the racks blinked in a steady, hypnotic rhythm blue. Green, blue. The system was alive. It was processing, learning, growing. I sat down at the terminal console. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I didn't need to look at the keys. I knew the syntax better than I knew my own handwriting. I typed in my credentials. The screen didn't flash red. It didn't deny me. It welcomed me. I looked at the code scrolling down the screen, the beautiful, complex logic that I had pulled from the ether of my mind. Sterling was gone. His yacht was seized, his reputation incinerated, the company name was gone, but the work remained. They had tried to erase me from the story. They didn't understand that I wasn't just a character in their narrative. I was the ink. I pressed the enter key. The update deployed. The system hummed a little louder, efficient, and unbreakable. I was exactly where I belonged. True power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply turns off the lights. Audrey proved that silence isn't weakness. It is the sound of a strategy clicking into place. If you have ever walked away from a table where respect was no longer served, remember this: you didn't quit, you leveled up. Your value is inherent, not assigned by a boss who can't read the code. If this story spoke to you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the corporate battlefield. Share this with someone who is still finding the courage to rewrite their own script.